Juliet Hargrove had been standing in the snow for less than 2 minutes when she found a man on a ladder above the porch roof, hammering a storm shutter back into place while ice crystals gathered in his dark hair. "Handyman," she called up, hoping he could point her toward the office. He glanced down at her without smiling. "Depends who's asking." Juliet lifted her rolled blueprints against the wind. "Then tell your boss that ignoring a cracked roof beam in a blizzard doesn't make the problem go away." If you're enjoying this story, this is Wintervale, and we'd love for you to hit subscribe and tap that like button before the ending catches up with you. Every winter, I come back to the same quiet belief that the cold season doesn't just freeze things, it slows them down long enough for people to finally see what was always there. That idea sits at the heart of what happens to Juliet and Colton, and I hope it finds you too. The man's jaw twitched like he was fighting a laugh. "I'll pass that along." Juliet didn't wait for anything more. She walked past him through the front doors of the Frostlight Inn, a 100-year-old building perched above a frozen Maine harbor, without knowing she had just lectured Colton Bishop, the fourth-generation owner, standing on his own roof. Inside, the lobby smelled like wood smoke and cedar, with a stone fireplace throwing gold light across faded rugs and mismatched armchairs. Snow pressed against every window in soft white drifts, but the room itself felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Juliet liked it instantly. That worried her, because she had come to renovate this place, not fall in love with its imperfections. A woman in her early 60s came around the front desk wiping her hands on an apron dusted with flour. "You must be the designer from Boston. Please tell me you're not afraid of snowstorms." Juliet smiled. "Depends how bad they get around here." The woman, who introduced herself as Bonnie Shaw, glanced toward the window where the sky had gone the color of slate. "Bad enough that we lost half a roof beam last week and nearly lost the generator with it." Juliet had spoken to the inn's ownership only through emails signed Bishop Property Group and through a lawyer who handled every contract detail. She knew the Frostlight had belonged to the Bishop family for 4 generations. She had never once spoken to Colton Bishop directly, and she had no idea what he looked like. "The owner will meet you eventually," Bonnie said, already turning back toward the kitchen. "He's around somewhere." The job itself was enormous. In 8 weeks, the inn needed to reopen for its annual Frostlight Gala, the single largest fundraising weekend of the year, the one that historically covered nearly a third of the inn's operating costs. 20 guest rooms needed refreshing, the lobby needed better flow for large groups, and somewhere in the building's aging bones, Juliet needed to find enough charm to convince wealthy donors this old place was worth saving. 10 minutes after she unrolled her plans across the library table, the same man from the ladder appeared carrying her sample case, which she'd left by her car in the snow. "You found that?" she said, surprised. "It was sitting in a snowbank," he answered, setting it down carefully. "I figured you'd want it before it froze shut." She studied him for a second too long, unable to decide if that was kindness or judgment. "Since you're already here," she said, handing him the end of her measuring tape, "hold this and tell your boss the west hallway needs better lighting before somebody breaks their neck." "I'll mention it," he said. "And the guest room windows are letting in a draft you could sail a boat through." "I'll mention that too. And somebody should explain why the third porch step groans loud enough to wake the harbor." "That one's on purpose," he said. "It warns Bonnie when the raccoons try to get into the kitchen at midnight." From the doorway, Bonnie called out, "Best security system we've got." Juliet laughed despite herself, and for the rest of that first hour, the man silently followed her from room to room, holding ladders and pointing out things the old survey had missed entirely: a section of foundation cracked from decades of freezing and thawing, a window frame that swelled every February when the harbor ice began to break. By the time they reached the basement, Juliet had stopped bothering to ask his name and started simply calling him you. "You know this building better than the blueprints do," she said, studying a section of stone wall that didn't match her drawings at all. "I've had more time with it," he answered, and something about the quiet way he said it made her wonder exactly how much time that meant. Back upstairs, Juliet paused by a window overlooking the frozen harbor, where fishing boats sat locked in ice like they were waiting for spring to release them. "Why restoration?" he asked, leaning against the frame. "You could design brand new hotels somewhere warm. Clean lines, no drafts, no groaning stairs." Juliet shook her head. "New buildings tell you what they are the moment you walk in. Old ones make you listen first." At the far end of the second-floor hallway, Juliet noticed two enormous double doors behind a heavy brass lock, their glass panes fogged with years of dust and cold. She didn't have time to ask about them that first day, because for the next 3 days, she and the man from the ladder seemed to end up in the same room every single hour, as if the old and kept steering them together on purpose. On the porch, she measured the spacing between breakfast tables while wind screamed off the water. Too close to the railing, he said without looking up from the shutter he was repairing. It's a porch, she answered. Wind happens out here. Not like this it doesn't, he said, and 20 minutes later a gust nearly tore her clipboard straight out of her hands, proving his point before she could argue it. In the library, she stepped directly onto a floorboard he had carefully stepped around all morning. It groaned so loudly she nearly dropped her pencil. You could have warned me, she snapped. I figured you were listening to the building, he said, and something about the dry, patient way he said it made her want to throw a paint swatch at his head. Near the kitchen, Juliet pointed at an old brass dinner bell hanging by the door. That can go, she said. Nobody uses dinner bells anymore. Bonnie does, he answered. As if summoned, Bonnie appeared and rang at once, the sound rolling clean through the whole first floor. Juliet jumped, and Bonnie grinned. My grandfather-in-law insisted nobody should ever eat soup cold, Colton said. He considered it a moral failure. Juliet laughed. Fine, the bell stays. That evening, while Juliet sketched by the fire, an older woman in a cardigan the color of cranberries settled into the armchair across from her with a cup of tea. I'm Delphine, she said. I've been coming here every February since my husband proposed to me in that dining room 41 years ago. Juliet smiled politely, still half lost in her drawings, until Bonnie leaned over later and told her the rest. Delphine's husband had passed the winter before, Bonnie explained under her breath while restocking the front desk. She still comes every year on the same week, alone now, and every year she asks for the same table by the window. Colton never charges her for the room, and never tells her that. Juliet looked up from her plans toward the dining room, where Delphine sat sipping tea and watching the snow fall exactly the way she must have watched it for 4 decades. By that afternoon, her notes had changed from simple measurements into something stranger. West hallway drafty. Third step intentional. Library floor loud near the window. None of it belonged in a professional survey, and none of it came from anywhere but a man who clearly knew every groan and draft in this building by heart. In one guest room, she held 3 paint cards against the wall. Frost linen, she said. He studied them. They're beige. Driftwood gray, she continued, undeterred. Also beige. Harbor mist, she finished. Colder beige. Juliet stared at him like he'd insulted her entire education. Those are 3 completely different colors. If you insist, he said, already turning back to a loose window latch, clearly unconvinced and clearly enjoying himself. One quiet afternoon, while Juliet helped Bonnie fold linens in the small laundry room, she finally asked how long Bonnie had worked at the Frostlight. Since I was 19, Bonnie said, smiling faintly. I came for a summer job and never quite left. Colton's mother taught me everything about running this place, and after she passed, staying felt like the only way to keep some part of her here. Juliet folded a towel slowly, unsure what to say. This building holds on to people, Bonnie said. It held on to me. I think it's starting to hold on to you too. Later that week, a contractor pointed to a section of carved molding near the dining room ceiling and suggested tearing it out entirely, since new stock would be cheaper and faster. The man from the ladder looked up immediately, his easy humor gone in an instant. No, he said, flatly enough that even the contractor blinked. Juliet climbed a short ladder to examine the wood herself and found the original carving still intact beneath years of grime. We repair what's salvageable and reproduce only what's missing, she said, siding with him before she fully understood why. The contractor sighed about the extra labor cost, and Juliet answered simply, then we spend the extra labor. She caught the man watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something warmer than approval, and something she chose not to examine too closely. You really hate replacing things, she said once the contractor had gone. He ran a thumb along the old wood. I hate replacing things just because fixing them takes longer, he said. Sometimes rooms have to change for the people using them now, she offered. Sometimes, he agreed, but not everything old is waiting to be thrown out. Neither of them was talking only about molding anymore, and they both seemed to know it. The following afternoon, while she measured the corridor near the locked double doors, her professional instincts kicked in without permission. If this room is as large as it looks, she said, tapping her pencil against the plan, opening it could solve half the inn's event space problem overnight. His screwdriver stopped turning completely. When she looked up, all the humor had drained from his face like water through cracked ice. That room stays closed, he said, in a voice so different from the one he'd used all week that Juliet actually flinched. I'm just trying to understand why the handyman has veto power over half the renovation, she said carefully. Consider it professional advice, he answered, already walking away before she could ask which profession that advice came from. Through the frosted glass of the double doors, Juliet could make out a wide hardwood floor stretching toward tall windows facing the frozen harbor, white sheets draped over what looked like chandeliers, and a small raised stage at the far end, its wood dulled by years without a single footstep. This is the best room in the entire building, she said, almost to herself. He said nothing at all, which somehow said everything. She found Bonnie downstairs later, sorting mail behind the front desk. Why is that room locked? She asked. Bonnie's hands paused mid-motion. Family decided a long time ago it wasn't ready to be used, she said carefully. No structural issues, nothing the inspectors ever flagged. Then why? Juliet pressed. It's not really my story to tell, Bonnie said gently, and closed the subject as firmly as the doors upstairs. That night, snow fell harder against the windows than it had all week, piling in soft drifts along the porch railing where the two sets of carved initials sat half-buried. Juliet lay awake longer than she meant to, thinking about a locked ballroom, a handyman with suspiciously strong opinions on preservation, and the particular way his face had changed the moment she mentioned opening that room for profit. The next morning, Juliet found pencil marks inside an old pantry door frame, faded height lines with initials beside them, CBH 6, and another set higher up. This should probably be sanded and refinished, she said absently. No, he said from behind her, so sharply she turned around. These are yours, she said, studying the letters. He nodded once. Family, he offered, and nothing more. By midweek, the list of things that could not be touched had grown suspiciously long. An old brass bell nobody used anymore except Bonnie, a scratched window seat where he admitted he used to read on snow days, and the carved initials on the porch railing that he refused to let anyone sand smooth. I carved mine at 11, he said. Someone else carved theirs because they refused to let me be the only one in trouble for it. By then, Juliet had stopped pretending she didn't notice him, tall and broad-shouldered in his flannel shirt, dark hair always slightly damp from the snow, blue eyes that softened whenever nobody else was watching. He, in turn, had started finding reasons to walk past the library twice as often as the work required, watching her chestnut braid fall loose over her shoulder while she muttered to herself over paint samples. That evening they sat on the covered porch with mugs of hot cider, watching snow fall soundlessly over the frozen harbor. I worked on a hotel in Boston last year, Juliet said. Marble everywhere, imported lighting, absolutely nothing anyone had ever touched with bare hands. It photographed beautifully, and it felt like nobody was allowed to leave a single mark on it. He listened without interrupting, which she was starting to notice he rarely did with anyone else. 2 mornings later, cold drizzle turned to sleet as they crouched together over a rusted porch lantern he insisted on saving instead of replacing. New wiring, he finally agreed, but the lantern itself stays. Of course it does, she said, smiling despite the cold biting through her gloves. And for a moment neither of them mentioned that they were no longer talking about a lantern at all. That afternoon, the town's small historical preservation committee arrived for their scheduled walkthrough, and Bonnie sent Juliet to the breakfast room to finally meet the elusive owner in person. Juliet arrived early, papers in hand, ready to charm a stranger she'd never once seen. The door opened, and the man from the ladder walked in wearing a wool blazer instead of a flannel shirt, and everyone in the room stood immediately. Mr. Bishop, good to see you, the committee chair said warmly, extending a hand. Juliet's stomach dropped through the floorboards. Every conversation from the past week rushed back at once. Tell your boss. Does your boss ever come down here? Mention it to the owner. Colton met her eyes across the table and, for once, offered no clever answer at all. She got through the presentation somehow, professional and steady even as her pulse hammered in her ears. When the committee finally cleared out, she gathered her plans without looking at him. "Juliet," he started. "Not now," she said. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me several," she answered, finally turning to face him properly. "I liked being the man holding the hammer," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Nobody talks to the owner the way you talked to me that first morning. I expected you to figure it out within 10 minutes, and when you didn't, I let it keep being true a little longer." Juliet folded her arms against the cold creeping through the hallway. "That doesn't make it fair," she said. "I know," he answered simply. "It isn't. People treat owners differently," he continued. "They watch what they say, they agree too fast, they stop arguing about beige. You never once did that." Juliet's voice shook despite herself. "That's not the point, Colton. I told you things about this project, about myself, thinking I was talking to someone with nothing at stake. That was never true, and you let me believe it anyway." He didn't try to defend himself further, which somehow made it worse and better at the same time. "You're right," he said simply. "I should have told you the first afternoon, and every day after that I didn't. I was choosing convenience over honesty. I'm not going to pretend that was fair to you." Juliet studied him for a long moment, searching for the easy joke he usually hid behind, and found none. "I need to think," she finally said, gathering her drawings. He nodded once and stepped aside without another word, and Juliet walked past the locked ballroom doors without looking at them, though she felt their weight the entire way down the hall. She needed space, she told him, and for 2 long days, he gave her exactly that, appearing only when a decision genuinely required his signature, never lingering, never bringing coffee to the library table the way he used to without being asked. She discovered, uncomfortably, that she missed the version of him that argued with her about beige paint chips and porch railings. On the 3rd afternoon, she found him outside clearing snow from the porch steps. "I need to understand the ballroom," she said, without any preamble at all. His shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn away. "If I'm designing this whole and around that locked room," she continued, "I need to know what I'm designing around." For a long moment, only the wind answered her, sweeping loose snow across the frozen harbor below. "My sister's name was Celeste," he finally said, sitting down on the top step beside her. "For years older than me, and completely certain the whole world got more interesting the second she walked into a room. She taught herself to waltz from old films in that ballroom, then decided that qualified her to teach me." "Were you any good?" Juliet asked. "Absolutely not," he said, and the ghost of a real smile crossed his face. "She was supposed to get married in that room," he continued, his voice quieter now. 2 weeks before the wedding, her car slid off an icy road during the season's first real storm. Juliet's breath caught somewhere in her chest. "I locked the doors after the funeral," he said. "I told myself I'd open them again once things settled. Then a season passed, then a year, then 12 of them, and somehow the door just stayed shut the whole time." Juliet didn't reach for him, and she didn't fill the silence with anything comforting and empty. "I can design this entire inn without ever opening that room," she finally said. "That would cost you the best space in the building," he answered. "I know," she said. "I'm not going to use your sister to win an argument about square footage." Something in his face loosened, just slightly, like ice cracking under gentle pressure. The very next morning, Juliet pulled the ballroom out of the center of her renovation plans entirely, redesigning event flow around the covered porch and the dining room instead, giving Colton a building that could survive and even thrive without ever forcing that door open before he was ready. When he saw the new plans, he studied them a long time before speaking. "You rebuilt half the ground floor around one locked room," he said. "It works," she answered simply. "It works better than before." Weeks passed, and the renovation moved forward in a rhythm that finally felt steady, snow blanketing the harbor a little deeper every night. Guest rooms slowly transforming under Juliet's careful hand, while Colton fixed everything else that broke around them. Neither of them mentioned the ballroom again, but Juliet noticed him slowing near that hallway sometimes, his fingers brushing the ring of keys at his belt before he walked away without unlocking anything. Then, 6 weeks before the gala, everything nearly fell apart at once. A man named Trevor Ashworth arrived unannounced, sharp charcoal coat, cold gray eyes, and a folder full of numbers that made Bonnie go pale behind the front desk. He introduced himself as a regional hotel investor, and within minutes made it clear he already knew exactly how much debt the Frostlight and was carrying after storm repairs the insurance hadn't fully covered. I'm prepared to offer a very generous buyout before your fundraiser even happens, Trevor said smoothly, sliding papers across the library table where Juliet's drawings still sat spread out. Colton didn't touch the folder. This one isn't for sale, he said. Trevor smiled thinly. Buildings this old rarely survive another bad winter without serious capital, he said. I'd hate to see the bank make that decision for you instead. After Trevor left, Bonnie finally admitted what she'd been hiding for weeks. The inn's mortgage had been quietly transferred to a smaller regional lender after their original bank restructured, and the new terms carried a clause allowing early recall of the full loan if a single payment landed late. One missed payment before the gala, and the bank could force a sale within 30 days, gala or no gala. Juliet stayed up that night studying the financial documents Bonnie finally handed over, and something about the timing bothered her immediately. The loan transfer had happened only 2 weeks before Trevor's very first email inquiring about the property. She didn't say anything to Colton yet, not until she had something more solid than a bad feeling and a suspicious coincidence. 3 days later, disaster struck twice in one night. A burst pipe in the newly renovated kitchen flooded half the first floor just as a second, unrelated fire alarm went off in the electrical panel Colton had personally inspected only that week. The same panel a hired subcontractor, one Juliet later learned had been paid an unusual cash bonus by an outside party, had supposedly finished repairing days earlier. They worked through the night in freezing water and smoke, Colton shutting off the mains while Juliet and Bonnie moved guests to dry rooms upstairs, snow still falling relentlessly outside the windows as if the storm itself were testing them. At one point Juliet slipped on the flooded floor, and Colton caught her arm before she went down, both of them soaked through and shaking with cold, neither willing to stop moving long enough to feel it. We're not losing this place tonight, Colton said through gritted teeth, hauling a soaked rug toward the door. Juliet, hair plastered to her face, nodded and kept working without arguing for once. By dawn, the kitchen was ruined, the electrical system needed a full replacement, and the gala, now only 3 weeks away, suddenly felt impossible. Juliet finally showed Colton the mortgage documents the next morning, laying out the timeline beside emails from Trevor's firm, the loan transfer, the suspicious repair bonus, and a missed permit filing that would have silently triggered a default clause if nobody caught it in time. Someone wants us to fail before the gala, she said. I think I know exactly who, and I think we can prove it. Together they tracked the cash payment back through invoices Bonnie had saved out of habit, straight to a subcontractor named Gary Fenwick, the same man who'd supposedly finished the electrical repairs days before the fire. Colton found him at a diner in town and set the invoice down on the table without a word. Gary went pale before either of them said anything. I didn't know it would catch fire, he said, staring at his coffee. I swear I didn't know that. Someone paid you to leave that panel unfinished, Colton said. It wasn't a question. Gary stared at his coffee for a long moment before answering. A man in a gray coat found me 2 weeks ago, said there was easy money in it if I signed off on work I hadn't actually finished. Said the inn was going under anyway, and I might as well get paid before it did. Colton's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. I need that in writing, he said. Gary nodded slowly, and by the next morning, a signed statement sat on Ms. Farrow's desk alongside the mortgage documents. Juliet, meanwhile, found the exact clause Trevor's people had buried in the new loan paperwork, one designed to trigger automatic default the moment any major repair went unpermitted for more than 14 days, a clause almost impossible to notice unless someone was specifically looking for it, which was exactly why Juliet, who had spent years learning to read fine print in renovation contracts, was the one who finally caught it. Colton drove into town through blowing snow to meet with the regional bank's actual loan officer, a careful woman named Ms. Farrow who listened to everything he laid out. The timeline, the bribed contractor's signed confession once confronted, and the paper trail connecting Trevor Ashworth's firm to the sudden purchase of their mortgage note. Ms. Farrow's expression hardened with every page she read. This isn't standard lending practice, she said finally. This looks like someone deliberately engineered a default. She promised a full internal review, and within days, state banking regulators were formally notified. The missed permit clause was voided as fraudulently obtained, and the loan was frozen pending investigation, buying the Frostlight in exactly the breathing room it desperately needed. Trevor Ashworth returned to the inn once more before word of the investigation reached him officially, still confident, still smiling. "I hear you've been busy," he said to Colton in the lobby, glancing at Juliet with something close to amusement. "You should know that stubbornness doesn't pay mortgages." Colton didn't raise his voice. "Neither does fraud," he said. "Ms. Farrow has your subcontractor's statement, the loan transfer records, and every email your firm sent this in before you ever set foot on the property." Trevor's smile finally faltered. "You have no idea how much money it takes to save a building like this," Trevor said, quieter now. "Maybe not," Colton answered, "but I know exactly how much it costs to lose one, and I've already paid that price once. I'm not paying it again for you." Trevor left without another word, his charcoal coat disappearing into the snow beyond the porch, and Juliet realized her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something closer to fierce, protective pride. Word moved fast through Cedar Hollow Harbor after that, the way it always does in small towns buried in snow together. Neighbors who had eaten breakfast on that porch for decades started showing up with tools, casseroles, and spare hands. A fisherman named Hollis Renner, who'd known Colton's grandfather, rewired half the dining room for the cost of a hot meal, and a carpenter named Silas Teague brought his 2 teenage sons to help finish the flooring, refusing payment outright. "This town doesn't let good places disappear," Silas said simply, and 3 more carpenters worked double shifts through the cold just to get everything ready in time. Juliet worked alongside them until her fingers ached from cold and sawdust, and somewhere in those long, exhausting days, she stopped thinking of the Frostlight as just another project and started thinking of it as somewhere she genuinely didn't want to leave. She caught herself watching Colton across a half-finished room more than once, and stopped pretending she didn't know exactly why. 2 weeks before the gala, an email arrived that Juliet hadn't expected and hadn't asked for, an offer from a prestigious restoration firm in Chicago, creative director of historic properties, her own design team, the kind of national opportunity she had spent her entire career hoping for. She read it 3 times at the library table before Colton found her staring at her phone. "What happened?" he asked, and she handed it over silently. He read every line carefully, his expression giving nothing away until he finally set the phone down. "You should take it," he said. Juliet had braced herself for almost any response except that one. "You're not even going to ask me to stay?" she said, more hurt than she meant to sound. "If I ask, would you?" he said gently. She didn't answer because she honestly wasn't sure. "I spent 12 years thinking a locked door meant I hadn't lost anything," he said, his voice low. "I know what fear dressed up as love looks like now, and I refuse to do that to you. If you stay because you're afraid of losing this town, you'll wonder someday who you might have become somewhere else. I don't want to be the reason you never find out." Juliet's eyes stung with unshed tears she refused to let fall in front of him. "You make it sound simple," she said, frustrated despite herself. "It isn't simple," he answered. "I'm not calm about this, Juliet. I just know what it looks like when fear starts pretending to be love, and I already lost 12 years to that particular disguise once. I won't ask you to lose anything to it too." She looked away toward the frozen harbor, unable to argue with a man who had already learned that lesson the hardest way possible. All week, some small stubborn part of her had wanted him to fight for her, to ask her to stay the way people did in the stories Bonnie liked to tell by the fire. Instead, he was doing something harder, trusting her enough to let her choose freely, and slowly Juliet understood that being chosen didn't always look like being kept. The night before the gala, with the ballroom still locked and the storm finally beginning to ease outside, Colton found Juliet in the library packing up sample books she insisted someone might still need. He set an old brass key on the table between them without a word. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice rough, "if you're still willing to be there when I open it." Juliet looked up at him, throat tight, and simply nodded. The morning of the gala arrived clear and bitterly cold, sunlight glittering across fresh snow blanketing the harbor in every direction. Colton stood outside the double doors with nothing but the key in his hand, and Juliet stood beside him, close enough to feel him breathing unevenly. "You should turn it," he said finally, holding the key out to her. She shook her head. "This one's yours." His hand tightened around the brass, and after a long moment, The lock gave way with a heavy click that seemed to echo down the entire hallway. Dust drifted through a beam of winter light as the doors swung open, revealing white sheets over stacked chairs, chandeliers dulled by years of neglect, and tall windows overlooking a harbor entirely frozen in silver and white. Near the small stage, Colton found a box that had clearly been packed carefully by careful hands: ribbon, folded place cards, and a bundle of ivory napkins yellowed slightly at the edges. "My mother packed those," he said softly. "Celeste hated those napkins," he added, a real laugh escaping him before he could stop it. "She said they looked like surrender flags." Juliet smiled through sudden tears of her own. Beneath an old wooden music stand, a folded scrap of paper fluttered loose when Colton lifted it. He unfolded it slowly, and his face changed the instant he recognized the handwriting. In looping blue ink, Celeste had written, "Don't just survive the winter, Colton, live it." He read it twice, then handed it silently to Juliet, who felt the words settle somewhere deep in her chest like snow finally melting. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke at all, standing together in a room that had held nothing but grief for 12 straight years and now held something else alongside it too. Then Colton walked slowly to the center of the dance floor, looked down at the faded boards beneath his boots, and without any music at all, moved one careful step, then another. "You're counting," Juliet said gently. "I always count," he admitted. "Apparently, you had written instructions not to." He held out his hand toward her, and Juliet crossed the room and took it without any hesitation left at all. There was no music yet, only waves somewhere beyond the frozen harbor and the quiet creak of an old building finally waking all the way up. By that evening, the ballroom had been transformed, chandeliers cleaned rather than replaced, the original floor gleaming beneath fresh light, and every window thrown open just enough to let cold winter air mix with candlelight and laughter. Donors who had come expecting a simple fundraiser found themselves standing inside a genuine miracle instead, and checks arrived faster than anyone had dared hope. Delphine arrived that evening in a dress the color of cranberries, and when the small band began to play near the restored chandeliers, she walked straight up to Colton and held out her hand. "My husband proposed to me in this building 41 years ago," she said. "Dance with an old woman, so I remember what that felt like." Colton obliged without hesitation, and Juliet watched from across the room, throat tight, as he guided Delphine slowly across the floor exactly the way his sister had once taught him. Near the end of the evening, Trevor Ashworth appeared briefly at the edge of the crowd, his charcoal coat now looking distinctly out of place among warm scarves and snow boots. Ms. Farrow's investigation had already gone public that week, exposing the fraudulent mortgage transfer and the bribe contractor, and Trevor left without a single word, disappearing into the snowy dark long before anyone had the satisfaction of confronting him directly. Later that night, once the last guests had gone and the fire had burned low, Colton found Juliet standing alone beneath the restored chandeliers, watching snow drift gently past the tall windows. "Chicago is still waiting for an answer," he said, his voice low. "I know," she answered, without turning around. "I'm not asking you to choose me over it," he said. "I know that too," she said, finally facing him. "That's exactly why I'm choosing to stay." He kissed her then, slow and unhurried, with snow falling silently beyond the glass and 12 years of silence finally, gently, breaking apart around them. When they separated, Juliet rested her forehead against his for a long moment. "I love you," she said, the first time either of them had said it aloud. "I love you too," he answered, and neither of them needed anything more than that. 1 year later, the Frostlight hosted its most successful Frostlight Gala in decades. The ballroom filled every winter with dancing, laughter, and the sound of a community that had refused to let one careful old building disappear. Juliet had turned down Chicago for a partnership with a small restoration firm in Portland, close enough to keep fixing porches and arguing about beige with the man she'd fallen for while mistaking him for the help. On the anniversary of the night they first opened the ballroom doors together, Colton led Juliet back inside after the last guests had gone, snow falling steadily beyond the tall windows just as it had that very first evening. He didn't say much, only reached into his coat pocket and knelt on the same floor where his sister had once taught him to dance. Juliet, hand pressed over her mouth, said yes before he'd even finished the question, And somewhere beyond the frozen harbor, the first real snow of another winter began to settle gently over Cedar Hollow. The carved initials on the porch railing stayed exactly where they'd always been, joined that spring by two new ones. Colton carved himself late one snowy evening, while Juliet pretended not to notice. And each December, as the first real snow finally settled over the frozen harbor, the ballroom doors opened wide once more, filled with music, warm light, and the quiet, hard-won proof that some things worth keeping are worth thawing out. If you were falling for someone right as your biggest dream finally called your name, would you stay for love, or trust that love strong enough to be real could survive the distance? Let me know down in the comments below. And if this story kept you warm tonight, don't forget to subscribe to Winter Veil so you never miss the next one.